The night I got the call from my publisher, my mother was sitting 3 feet away from me, telling my aunt that I'd never amounted to anything. I want you to sit with that for a second. 3 feet. The distance between the couch where she was folding laundry and the kitchen counter where I stood. Phone pressed to my ear, hand gripping the edge of the granite so hard my knuckles went white. My editor's voice in my ear saying the words I'd waited 8 years to hear. And my mother's voice, slightly lower, the way she always got when she was talking about me to someone else, saying, she always had her head in the clouds. Some people just don't have that drive, you know? I said, yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. Into the phone. I set it down on the counter. I walked to the bathroom and I sat on the floor against the tub and I cried. Not because I was sad. Because I had been waiting my entire life for that phone call. And I still couldn't share it with the 2 people in the next room. My name is Sloan, and this is the story of how I became a national best-selling author while my parents told anyone who'd listen that I was wasting my life. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario. If you're not from Northern Ontario, all you need to know is that it's the kind of place where ambition gets mistaken for arrogance. Where you don't talk about wanting more because someone will always remind you that you're not that special. My dad worked in mining operations for 32 years. My mom worked part-time at a dental office and spent the rest of her time managing the social ledger of our extended family, which, in her mind, was the most important job anyone could have. They weren't cruel people. That's the complicated part. They were just relentlessly, exhaustingly small in their thinking. Not about themselves. About me. My older brother got a trade certificate and started working with my dad when he was 19. My parents threw him a party. They bought him a truck. My dad called him the practical one, like it was the highest compliment he'd ever given anyone. And maybe it was. When I was 12, I wrote a short story for a school contest. It won first place at the provincial level. The teacher called my parents personally to tell them. My mom's response when she got off the phone was, well, just make sure your math marks don't slip. That was it. That was the whole thing. I kept writing anyway. I wrote in notebooks I hid under my mattress. I wrote fan fiction under a pseudonym on forums at 2 a.m. I wrote terrible, earnest, embarrassing poetry that I never showed anyone. I wrote because it was the only place I existed fully without anyone measuring me against something else. In high school, my English teacher, Mr. Arsenault, pulled me aside after class one day and told me I had a genuine gift. He said it quietly, almost like he was breaking a rule. You should pursue this, Sloan. Seriously. He gave me a list of creative writing programs at Canadian universities. I folded it up and carried it in my jacket pocket for a month before I got up the nerve to show my parents. My dad looked at the list for about 4 seconds. You can't make a living writing, he said. Nobody does. My mom added helpfully. Your cousin finished her nursing degree last spring. They're always hiring nurses. I applied to the creative writing program at the University of British Columbia anyway. I didn't tell them I was applying. I filled out the forms at the library after school, paid the application fee with birthday money I'd been saving, and when the acceptance letter came in February, I hid it in the same place I'd hidden my notebooks. I got a partial scholarship. I got a student loan for the rest. I deferred for a year, worked 2 jobs, and saved every dollar I could. When I finally told my parents I was moving to Vancouver to study creative writing, my dad went quiet in that particular way he had. The way that meant he was deciding whether to argue or just to write you off. He chose to write me off. It's your life, he said. But the way he said it meant the opposite. It meant, don't come to me when this fails. It meant, I don't understand you, and I've stopped trying. My mom cried. Not because she was proud, because she was embarrassed. Because she'd have to explain to people why her daughter wasn't studying something practical. I moved to Vancouver in September. I was 20 years old with 2 duffel bags and $1,100 in my account and more terror than I've ever felt before or since. But underneath the terror, there was something else. Something that felt like oxygen after years of holding my breath. UBC was the first place I ever felt like I belonged. I found other writers, people who talked about books the way I thought about them, obsessively and constantly and without apology. I had professors who marked up my pages and pushed me to go further. and told me the hard things with enough kindness that I could hear them. I fell in love with the craft in a way I hadn't even known was possible when I was writing alone in Sudbury under the covers with a flashlight. I called home every 2 or 3 weeks. The calls were 15 minutes long, polite, and depressing. My mom asked if I was eating. My dad asked if I'd figured out a plan yet, by which he meant a plan to do something else. Sometimes my brother got on the line and told me about a renovation he was doing or a weekend trip he took. And those conversations were easier because at least he wasn't disappointed in me, just indifferent. In my second year, I started a novel. It was about a woman trying to recover pieces of her grandmother's life after the grandmother's death. Moving between northern Ontario and rural Quebec, tracing a family history that had been deliberately hidden. I know. I was writing about myself without knowing I was writing about myself. That's usually how it works. I finished a draft in my 4th year. It was not good. I finished another draft the year after I graduated. It was better. I moved into a tiny apartment in East Vancouver with 2 roommate seats and worked as a barista and then as an office administrator and kept writing. I sent the manuscript to agents. I got rejected. I revised. I sent it again. More rejections. My parents never asked about the book. Once, my mom mentioned that a woman from their church had a daughter who'd gotten a job at a bank in Toronto. Good benefits, she said. Stable. There was a pause that meant something, and I let it pass without answering it. When I was 26, I got an email from a literary agent in Toronto named, well, she knows who she is. She said she'd been moved by my pages and wanted to see the full manuscript. I sat with my laptop in the back room of the coffee shop where I was working and read the email 4 times. Then I went and cleaned the espresso machine because I didn't know what else to do with my body. She offered me representation 3 weeks later. We spent 6 months revising. Then she submitted to publishers. There were rejections. Then there was interest. Then there was an offer. It was a 2-book deal with a mid-sized Canadian press. The advance wasn't retire-on-it money. This isn't that kind of story. But it was real. And it was mine and it was happening. I was 27 years old. I had gone home for Easter. That was the visit I told you about at the beginning. My mother folding laundry, talking to my aunt about how I'd never amounted to anything, 3 feet away from me when my editor called. I didn't tell them that night. I sat through dinner. I listened to my dad talk about a guy at work who'd just bought a new boat. I helped clear the dishes. I drove back to the hotel I was staying at because staying in my childhood bedroom had started to feel like wearing a shirt that was 3 sizes too small, and I sat on the bed and thought about what it meant that the best day of my professional life had just happened inside the worst possible version of home. I told them the next morning at breakfast. I set my coffee cup down and I said, I got a publishing deal. My novel is going to be published next fall. My dad looked at me over his glasses. How much does that pay? My mom said, is it a real publisher? Or one of those self-publishing things? I said it was a real publisher. I said the name. Neither of them recognized it, which was fine, but neither of them asked a follow-up question, which was not fine. Or rather, it was completely predictable, which is somehow worse. My dad said, well, good for you then. And that was Easter breakfast. I drove to the airport 2 hours later. I cried most of the way to Thunder Bay and then pulled myself together because I had a connection to catch. The book came out the following October. It was called The Distance Between Us. I'm allowed to tell you the title now because it's been out long enough that it's a matter of public record. The reviews were good. Really good. The Globe and Mail gave it 4 stars as Quill and Quire called it a quietly devastating debut. I did a reading at Indigo on Blow and there was actually a lineup, which is not a given for a first-time author, I promise you. I sent my parents a copy in the mail. I included a short note. I did not expect much. My mom texted 2 weeks later to say she'd started it and it was pretty good. My dad did not acknowledge it at all. By December, the book had sold out its first print run. The publisher ordered a second. In January, my agent called me to say we'd been longlisted for the Giller Prize. I sat down on the kitchen floor. Just sat down because my legs stopped working. The Giller. You have to understand what that means in Canadian literary culture. It's not just an award, it's a signal. It's the thing that tells the whole country, this matters. This is real. I called my brother first. He said, "Holy crap, Sloan, that's huge." Which was the best response I'd gotten from anyone in my family in my entire adult life. And I cried a little, and he was uncomfortable about it in the way that brothers are, and I loved him for that. Then I called my parents. My mom picked up. I told her. There was a silence that lasted long enough that I started to wonder if the call had dropped. Then she said, "What's the Giller Prize?" I explained it. She listened. Then she said, "Oh, well, that's wonderful, sweetheart." Something about the way she said it, sweetheart, a word she barely ever used, suddenly available now, made my stomach tighten. In a way I hadn't anticipated, my dad got on the line. "That's the big one, is it?" he said. "I'll have to tell people about that." And I understood immediately that this was the part that mattered to him. Not the book, not the years of work, not me, sitting alone in apartments for years, choosing this over and over again when no one believed in me. The part that mattered was that now there was something to tell people. The gala was in Toronto in November. It's a big deal. Black tie, the whole thing, broadcasted. My publisher arranged tickets. I asked my parents if they wanted to come. There was a pause, and then my mom said they'd try to make it work. And I knew from years of experience what try to make it work meant. They didn't come. My aunt and uncle came though. I'd called my aunt on impulse 2 months before the ceremony, and she'd said yes before I'd finished the sentence. She showed up in a dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion, and she grabbed my face in both hands when she saw me and said, "I am so proud of you," I could burst, and I almost had to excuse myself, because I wasn't ready for that. I didn't win. I want to be honest about that. I was shortlisted, and I didn't win, and there was a moment when they called the winner's name, where I had to keep my face very still and remind myself that being shortlisted for the Giller in your first year of publishing is extraordinary, which it is, and which didn't fully stop the disappointment. Because I'm human. But what happened after was not something I could have written. We were at the reception. About an hour into the evening, my aunt and uncle were talking to someone from my publisher's team. I was standing with a glass of wine talking to a journalist from the CBC who was doing a feature on debut authors, and my phone buzzed. I looked down. It was my mom. I almost didn't answer, but something made me step away from the conversation and pick up. "We watched it on CBC, she said. "We watched the whole thing." I didn't say anything. "Sloan." Her voice was different, tighter, like she was pushing the words out from somewhere they didn't want to come from. You looked so beautiful up there." And the way they talked about your book, the things they said. Another pause. I had no idea. I didn't know it was like that. I said, "Like what, Mom?" She said, "Like that it was that important. That people cared that much." I stood in the corner of that reception hall in a dress I'd spent 2 weeks finding, holding a phone to my ear, and I tried to figure out what to do with what she was saying. Because here's the thing, and this is the part I've thought about the most in the years since. She wasn't wrong that she didn't know, but she'd had every opportunity to find out. She just hadn't taken any of them. She hadn't asked. She hadn't read the reviews I'd sent. She hadn't looked up the press. She hadn't tried in any of the 8 years since I'd moved away to understand what I was building, and now the CBC had done it for her. "I know, Mom," I said. It was all I could say. My dad called the next morning. He said, "I watched it. I want you to know I'm proud of you." He said it carefully, like he was reading from a card. But he said it. I thanked him. I meant it, and I also didn't know what to do with it, both at the same time. That was 2.5 years ago. Things are different now, but different in the way that means slow and complicated, and not fixed, which is maybe the most honest version of what better looks like when you've spent a long time being hurt by people who didn't know they were hurting you, or who knew and just couldn't stop. My mom has read all of my books now. She calls me sometimes just to talk, which is new. She asked me last spring what I was working on, asked with genuine curiosity. Not with the edge of concern that used to mean, "When are you going to stop?" And I told her about the third book, and she listened for 20 minutes without steering the conversation anywhere else. I cried after we hung up, not because I was sad. My dad told someone at his golf club about the Giller nomination, and the man, apparently, had actually read the book and told my dad it was one of the best things he'd read in years. My dad called to tell me this story. He seemed a little stunned by it, like the reality of what I do had suddenly passed through someone he considered a peer and become legible to him for the first time. I didn't say what I was thinking, which was, I know, I've known for a long time. I was just waiting for you to catch up. I'm not bitter. I want to be clear about that, or as clear as I can be, because it's not entirely simple. The years when I didn't have their support were also the years when I learned that I didn't need it, that I could keep going without it, that the work had value independent of whether they could see it. Those years made me, in a way that their approval never could have. If they'd been different, I might have been easier, and also lesser. But I won't pretend it didn't cost me something. It did. It cost me years of feeling like I was the problem. Too much, too strange, too impractical, too committed to something no one around me valued. It cost me the easy comfort of coming home without bracing myself. It cost me the simple thing that I think a lot of people have without knowing to be grateful for. The feeling that the people who made you are also rooting for you. The second book did better than the first. I'll leave it at that. Last Christmas, I went home to Sudbury. My dad picked me up at the airport. He was holding a copy of a magazine, one of those Air Canada in-flight magazines, folded open to a page. He held it out without saying anything. It was a piece about Canadian debut authors to watch. There was a photo of me. He'd carried it to the airport to show me that he'd found it, that he'd looked for it. He didn't say anything. He handed it to me and then picked up my bag and started walking toward the car. I stood there for a second in the arrivals hall holding this magazine, and I thought about the 12-year-old who'd won a provincial writing contest and come home to just make sure your math marks don't slip. And I thought, okay, this is what it looks like. Not the thing I needed then, but maybe enough for now. I chose the hard way. I chose the uncertain thing. I chose to trust something in myself that no one else could see yet, and to keep trusting it through every rejection and every quiet holiday dinner and every phone call that ended without anyone asking how the work was going. I chose to be that girl from Sudbury who hid her notebooks under the mattress. And it turned out she was worth choosing.